The thunder cracked like a rifle shot as Maverick Holloway threw open his cabin door, expecting to find a wounded coyote or perhaps a lost traveler. Instead, a woman stood trembling on his porch, her burgundy traveling dress torn and mud-splattered, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild tendrils. Rain lashed at her pale face as she clutched a carpetbag against her chest like armor. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I have nowhere else to go." Maverick's weathered hand tightened on the doorframe. In 15 years of ranching in the remote Colorado Territory, he'd learned to be suspicious of strangers, especially beautiful ones, who appeared out of nowhere during the worst storm of the season. But something in her desperate green eyes made him step aside. "Get in before you catch your death," he muttered. Grabbing a wool blanket from the nearby chair, she stumbled across the threshold, water pooling at her feet on the rough wooden floor. "Thank you. I'm Cordelia Whitmore, and I don't much care who you are right now," Maverick interrupted, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "You're half frozen and soaked to the bone. Explanations can wait." He guided her to the stone fireplace where orange flames danced, casting long shadows across the sparse but clean cabin. Cordelia's teeth chattered as she held her hands toward the warmth, and Maverick found himself studying her profile, the elegant curve of her neck, the determined set of her jaw despite her obvious distress. "There's coffee on the stove," he said gruffly, moving toward the kitchen area, "and I've got some stew left from supper." "You're very kind, Mr. Holloway, Maverick Holloway." He ladled the thick beef stew into a bowl, acutely aware of how his rough hands seemed too large for the simple task. "Been ranching this land for going on 16 years now." Cordelia accepted the bowl gratefully, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. Even through the cold, he felt the spark of contact. "I was supposed to meet my intended in Copper Falls today, but the stagecoach broke an axle 20 miles back. The driver said it would be morning before help could arrive, and with this storm... She trailed off, staring into the fire. Maverick poured 2 cups of coffee, his mind racing. Mail-order brides weren't uncommon in these parts, but something about her story felt incomplete. "Copper Falls is a hard day's ride from here. You walked all this way?" "I had no choice." Her voice carried a note of steel beneath the exhaustion. "The other passengers took shelter in the coach, but I couldn't stay there." The way she said it made Maverick's jaw tighten. He'd seen enough desperate women fleeing desperate situations to recognize the signs. Whatever had driven Cordelia Whitmore to answer a stranger's advertisement for a wife, it wasn't just the promise of a better life. Lightning illuminated the cabin's single window, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations. Cordelia flinched, and Maverick noticed how her knuckles whitened as she gripped the coffee cup. "Storm's getting worse," he observed. "You'll be staying the night whether you plan to or not." As the storm raged outside, Maverick found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Cordelia had removed her ruined traveling jacket, revealing a simple white blouse that, despite being damp and wrinkled, couldn't disguise her graceful bearing. She moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to scrutiny, her spine straight even in exhaustion. "You're intended," Maverick said carefully, settling into the chair across from her. "What's he like?" Cordelia's cup paused halfway to her lips. "Jasper Crowthorne. He owns a mercantile in Copper Falls. Our correspondence has been ... cordial." The hesitation in her voice spoke volumes. Maverick had seen enough arranged marriages in his time to know the difference between hope and resignation. "You've never met him?" "No." She set down her cup with deliberate care. "But he seemed like a good man from his letters, steady, reliable. And that's what you're looking for? Steady and reliable?" A shadow crossed her features. "At this point in my life, Mr. Holloway," steady and reliable sound like paradise. Maverick leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What are you running from, Miss Whitmore?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Cordelia's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt, and for a moment, Maverick thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My stepfather." The words carried the weight of years of suffering. "After my mother died last spring, he made it clear that my continued presence in his house came with certain expectations." Maverick's hands clenched into fists. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. "So you answered Crowthorne's advertisement. It seemed like the only way out." "I sold my mother's jewelry to pay for the journey west." She looked up at him then, and the vulnerability in her eyes nearly undid him. "I know it sounds desperate, sounds smart to me," Maverick interrupted. "Took courage to leave everything behind and travel this far alone." Cordelia blinked in surprise, as if she'd expected judgment rather than understanding. "Most people would say I was foolish. A woman traveling alone, going to marry a stranger ... Most people haven't walked in your shoes." Maverick rose and added another log to the fire, the flames casting his rugged features in sharp relief. "Sometimes the unknown is better than the devil, you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Maverick found himself remembering his own reasons for seeking solitude in this remote corner. Of Colorado, the memories he'd tried to outrun, the grief that had driven him to build this life of deliberate isolation. "What about you?" Cordelia asked suddenly. "Have you always lived alone out here?" The innocent question hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Near 15 years now. It suits me. But don't you get lonely?" Maverick met her gaze steadily. "Loneliness and being alone aren't the same thing, Miss Whitmore. Sometimes solitude is exactly what a man needs." Something in his tone must have warned her off further questions, because she simply nodded and turned back to the fire. But Maverick caught the way she looked at him, not with pity or curiosity, but with understanding, as if she too knew. The difference between choosing solitude and having it thrust upon you. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Maverick realized he would need to make sleeping arrangements. His cabin was small, just the main room with the fireplace, a tiny kitchen area, and his bedroom. The thought of this beautiful, vulnerable woman sharing his space for the night sent an unexpected jolt through him. "You can take my bed," he said. Abruptly, "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Cordelia shook her head. "I couldn't possibly. It's not a discussion." His tone brooked no argument. "You've been through enough today without spending the night on a hard floor." The night stretched, long and restless. Maverick lay on a bedroll near the dying fire, acutely aware of Cordelia's presence beyond the thin wooden door. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of wind seemed amplified in the darkness. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, but tonight the silence felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Around midnight, he heard her moving about, soft footsteps crossing the bedroom floor. A moment later, she emerged wrapped in one of his quilts, her hair loose around her shoulders like spun silk. "I can't sleep," she said quietly. "The storm... But Maverick could see it wasn't just the weather keeping her awake. In the dim firelight, her face was pale with exhaustion and something deeper, the haunted look of someone who'd learned to expect the worst from every shadow. "Come sit by the fire," he offered, rising to add another log. "Sometimes it helps to have company when the demons come calling." Cordelia settled beside him on the braided rug, pulling the quilt close around her. "You speak as if you know something about demons, Mr. Holloway." "Maverick," he corrected. "And yes, I reckon I do." They sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Finally, Cordelia spoke. "What brought you out here? To this isolated place? Maverick considered deflecting, as he had earlier, but something about the intimacy of the moment, the storm outside, the firelight, her quiet presence beside him, made him want to be honest. I had a family once, he said slowly. A wife named Catherine. We had a spread closer to town, raised cattle and horses. She was ... double quotes. He paused, searching for words. She was everything good in the world. Cordelia remained silent, sensing the weight of what he was about to share. Fever took her in the winter of '71. Then the bank took the ranch 6 months later when I couldn't keep up with the payments. Lost everything in the span of a year. His voice was steady, but Cordelia could hear the old pain beneath it. Came out here because I needed to be somewhere she'd never been. Somewhere that didn't echo with her voice. I'm sorry, Cordelia whispered. That must have been unbearable. Maverick looked at her then, surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. Most people offered empty platitudes when they learned about Catherine, but Cordelia's words carried the weight of someone who understood loss. What about you? He asked. Besides your stepfather, what are you leaving behind? Cordelia was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I was engaged once, before my mother died, to a banker's son in Philadelphia, a proper match, my mother called it. But when she became ill, I broke off the engagement to care for her, and he couldn't wait? A bitter smile crossed her lips. Preston made it clear that he had no intention of marrying into a family with complications. He wanted a wife who could focus entirely on his social aspirations, not one burdened with a dying mother. Maverick felt another surge of anger at the men who had failed this remarkable woman, his loss. Cordelia turned to look at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. You're very kind to say so. I'm not kind, Miss Whitmore. I'm honest. He held her gaze steadily. Any man fool enough to walk away from you deserves exactly what he gets, which is nothing worth having. The compliment hung between them, more powerful for being unexpected. Cordelia felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When had anyone last looked at her with such genuine respect and admiration? Cordelia, she said softly. My name is Cordelia. Cordelia. He tested the name on his tongue, liking the way it sounded in the quiet cabin. Pretty name for a pretty woman. She blushed, unused to such straightforward appreciation. In her world, compliments had always come with strings attached, expectations. That made her skin crawl. But there was nothing calculating in Maverick's manner, nothing that made her want to shrink into herself. The storm began to ease, the thunder growing more distant. They talked until dawn crept through the windows, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, the roads that had led them to this unlikely meeting. By the time the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, something fundamental had changed. Between them, dawn brought a crystalline clarity to the mountain air, the storm having washed the world clean. Maverick woke to find Cordelia already up, standing at the window with her back to him, watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of amber and gold. She'd managed to repair her hair somewhat, twisting it into a simple knot at the base of her neck, but she still wore his shirt over her damaged blouse. It's beautiful, she said without turning around. I never imagined the wilderness could be so ... peaceful. Maverick rose, noting how right she looked standing in his cabin, how the morning light seemed to favor her profile. It has its moments. Coffee? Please. She turned to face him, and he was struck again by her natural grace, the way she moved like music given form. I should probably think about getting to Copper Falls today. The words hit him like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. Of course she needed to leave. She had a life waiting for her, a man who'd promised to marry her. That she'd spent one night in his cabin didn't change the fundamental reality of their situations. "I'll saddle up, Storm, and ride with you," he said, busying himself with the coffee to avoid looking at her. "Can't have you walking that distance alone. You don't need to." "I do." His tone was final. "These mountains can be dangerous for someone who doesn't know them." Cordelia nodded, but something in her manner had changed. The easy intimacy of the previous night seemed to have evaporated with the morning light, replaced by a careful politeness that made Maverick's chest tight. They ate breakfast in relative silence: eggs from his chickens, bacon from his smokehouse, biscuits that Cordelia had somehow managed to make from his sparse pantry. She was, he realized, an excellent cook, seasoning the simple meal with herbs she'd found in his garden. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," he said, savoring the best breakfast he'd had in years. "It was the least I could do." "You've been more than kind to a stranger." There was that word again, stranger. As if the hours they'd spent talking by the fire, sharing their deepest hurts and fears, meant nothing in the harsh light of day. As they prepared to leave, Maverick watched Cordelia transform herself back into the proper lady who'd arrived on his doorstep. She pinned her hair just so, smoothed her skirts, and donned the traveling jacket despite its tears and stains. By the time she was finished, she looked every inch the mail-order bride on her way to meet her intended husband. The ride to Copper Falls took 3 hours through country that showed off the Colorado Territory at its finest. Rolling meadows carpeted with wildflowers, crystal streams cascading down granite faces, stands of aspen that shimmered like coins in the breeze. Under normal circumstances, Maverick would have enjoyed the journey. Today, each mile felt like a countdown to an ending he didn't want to face. Cordelia rode behind him on Storm, her arms around his waist for balance. He tried not to think about how right it felt to have her there, how her presence seemed to complete something in him he hadn't even realized was broken. "Maverick," she said as they crested a hill that offered a view of Copper Falls in the distance. "About last night, ... What about it?" His voice was carefully neutral. "I want you to know that. It meant something to me. Our conversation, your kindness, ... It meant something." He reined in Storm and turned to look at her. "But," Cordelia met his gaze steadily, "but I have obligations. Commitments I've made. Mr. Crowthorne is expecting me, and he's already paid for my passage west. And what if he's not what you hoped? What if steady and reliable turns out to be something else entirely?" For a moment, vulnerability flickered across her features. "Then I'll make the best of it. I've learned to adapt, Maverick. It's how I've survived this long." The resignation in her voice made him want to pull her down from the horse and kiss her until she remembered what it felt like to want something more than mere survival. Instead, he clicked his tongue and urged Storm forward toward the town that would take her away from him forever. Copper Falls proved to be larger than Maverick had expected, a bustling frontier town with a main street lined by prosperous-looking businesses and a train depot that promised connections to the wider world. As they rode down the dusty thoroughfare, Cordelia straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, preparing to meet her fate with dignity. "There," she said, pointing to a well-maintained storefront with Crowthorne Mercantile painted in gold. Letters across the window. That must be it. Maverick felt his stomach clench as he helped her down from Storm. This was it then. In a few minutes, she would walk through that door and become another man's responsibility, another man's wife. The thought made him want to wheel his horse around and ride back to his mountain sanctuary as fast as Storm could carry him. But something made him stay. Maybe it was the way Cordelia's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts, or the almost imperceptible pause before she squared her shoulders. Whatever it was, Maverick found himself dismounting and tying Storm to the hitching post. "I'll wait," he said simply. "Make sure everything's suitable." Cordelia shot him a grateful look. Thank you. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the mercantile. The store was well appointed, shelves lined with goods from back east, bolts of fine fabric, china tea sets, leather-bound books. Behind the counter stood a man in his 40s, thin and pale with receding brown hair and calculating eyes that immediately fixed on Cordelia with hungry satisfaction. Miss Whitmore, I presume? Jasper Crowthorne's voice was smooth, cultured, but something about it made Maverick's skin crawl. I was beginning to worry when you didn't arrive yesterday. The stagecoach broke down, Cordelia explained, her voice carefully modulated. I was fortunate to find shelter with Mr. Holloway here. Crowthorne's gaze flicked to Maverick with obvious displeasure. I see. Well, you're here now, which is what matters. He moved around the counter with the air of a man inspecting merchandise. You're prettier than your photograph suggested. That's good. A man in my position needs a wife who reflects well on his standing in the community. Maverick saw Cordelia stiffen at the casual assessment, but she managed a polite smile. I hope I'll prove satisfactory in all respects, Mr. Crowthorne. Oh, I'm sure you will. Crowthorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. I've taken the liberty of arranging our wedding for this afternoon. Reverend Mills is expecting us at 3 o'clock. This afternoon? Cordelia couldn't hide her surprise. But I thought we might have time to become better acquainted first. Nonsense. We've corresponded extensively. Besides, I have a business to run. I can't afford extended courtship rituals. He turned to a woman who'd been watching from the corner of the store, middle-aged, sharp-featured, with cold eyes. Mrs. Hartwell here will help you prepare. She's agreed to serve as your attendant. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward with a smile that looked more like a grimace. Come along, dear. We'll need to do something about that dress, and your hair could use attention. As the woman began to shepherd Cordelia toward the back of the store, Maverick caught the flash of panic in her green eyes. She was going through with it, but every line of her body screamed resistance. Actually, Maverick found himself saying, I wonder if I might have a word with Miss Whitmore first. Privately. Crowthorne's expression darkened. I hardly think that's appropriate. She's to be my wife in a matter of hours. Just a brief conversation. We traveled together, after all. The merchant's jaw tightened, but he couldn't think of a reasonable objection. Very well. 5 minutes. Maverick guided Cordelia to a corner of the store, lowering his voice so only she could hear. Are you sure about this? What choice do I have? She whispered back. I gave my word. He's paid for my passage. That doesn't make you his property, doesn't it? Her laugh was bitter. I have no money, nowhere to go. At least with Mr. Crowthorne, I'll have security. Maverick studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. What if you had another choice? What do you mean? Before he could lose his nerve, Maverick reached for her hands. Come back with me, to the mountain. Cordelia's eyes widened. Maverick, you can't mean. I mean exactly what I'm saying. His voice was low but intense. Marry me instead. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to fate itself. Cordelia stared at Maverick, her lips parted in shock, while across the store, Jasper Crowthorne's voice droned on to Mrs. Hartwell about his expectations for the wedding ceremony. You're not serious, Cordelia whispered. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Maverick's hands tightened around hers. I know it sounds crazy. We've known each other less than 24 hours. But sometimes crazy is the only thing that makes sense. You don't understand what you're asking. I'm not whole, Maverick. My stepfather, he hurt you. I know. Maverick's voice was gentle but firm. That doesn't make you broken, Cordelia. That makes you a survivor. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. I came here to marry Mr. Crowthorne. I gave my word to a stranger who's already treating you like property he's purchased. Maverick glanced toward Crowthorne, who was examining a pocket watch with the focused attention of a man calculating profit margins. Is that really the life you want? Being inspected and found satisfactory? Cordelia followed his gaze, taking in Crowthorne's pale, calculating features the cold efficiency with which he'd arranged their hasty wedding. She thought of the way he'd looked at her, not as a woman to be courted, but as an acquisition to be managed. "What are you offering?" "Me instead?" she asked quietly. "Honestly, I don't know." Maverick's confession was startling in its simplicity. "I live alone on a mountain, raise cattle, and talk to my horse more than most people. I'm not wealthy like Crowthorne, and I can't promise you society or security." "Then why? Because when I look at you, I don't see someone who needs to be managed or improved or made satisfactory. I see someone worth knowing, worth choosing." He paused, studying her face. "And because last night, for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel alone." The sincerity in his words hit her like a physical force. No one had ever spoken to her that way, not as an obligation, or a burden, or a prize to be won, but as a person whose very existence had value. "Miss Whitmore," Crowthorne called impatiently, "we really must begin your preparations." Cordelia looked back at him, then at Mrs. Hartwell's stern, disapproving face, then at the bolt of cheap fabric they'd selected for her wedding dress. Life stretching ahead of her suddenly seemed as narrow and confining as a coffin. "I need air," she said suddenly, loud enough for Crowthorne to hear. "Just a moment outside." Before anyone could object, she swept through the door onto the wooden sidewalk, Maverick close behind her. The afternoon sun was warm on her face, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear children laughing as they played in the dusty street. "Cordelia." Maverick's voice was careful, giving her space to think. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But don't choose out of fear. Don't choose what you think you should want instead of what you actually want." She closed her eyes, letting the sun warm her face as she tried to imagine two different futures. In one, she saw herself in Crowthorne's neat parlor, serving tea to his business associates, her life measured out in careful, respectable increments. In the other, she saw Maverick's cabin nestled among the peaks, felt the wild freedom of the mountains, imagined waking each morning to beauty that took her breath away. "If I come with you," she said slowly, "what happens when you tire of me? When the novelty wears off and you remember that you prefer solitude?" Maverick was quiet for a long moment. "I can't promise I'll be easy to live with. I've gotten set in my ways, and I'm not used to considering anyone else's needs. But I can promise you this, I'll never make you feel like a burden. And I'll never make you feel like you have to earn your place in my life." The simple honesty of it nearly undid her. She thought of all the ways she'd learned to make herself small, useful, unobtrusive. The idea of being wanted simply for who she was seemed almost too good to be true. "Miss Whitmore." Crowthorne's voice carried a sharp edge of annoyance as he appeared in the doorway. "This delay is most inappropriate. We have preparations to complete." Cordelia looked at him, then at Maverick, then back at the man who considered her his purchased bride. In that moment, something crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. "Mr. Crowthorne," she said, turning to face him fully, "I'm afraid I must respectfully withdraw from our agreement." Jasper Crowthorne's face went through several rapid, colored changes from pale to red to a mottled purple that suggested imminent apoplexy. "I beg your pardon?" "I said I must withdraw from our agreement." Cordelia's voice grew stronger with each word. "I cannot marry you." "Cannot?" Crowthorne sputtered. "This is preposterous. We have a contract. I've paid good money for your passage." "Arrange the ceremony. I'll repay every cent," Cordelia interrupted, though she had no idea how she would manage such a thing. "But I cannot go through with this marriage." Mrs. Hartwell had appeared behind Crowthorne, her face pinched with disapproval. "Young woman, you're being utterly foolish. Mr. Crowthorne is a respectable man offering you security and position. What more could a woman in your circumstances possibly want?" The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions about what women like Cordelia should be grateful to accept. But as she looked at Maverick standing quietly beside her, she realized she knew exactly what more she wanted. "I want to be seen," she said simply. "I want to be valued for who I am, not what I can provide. I want to wake up each morning without fear, without calculating how to make myself acceptable." She looked directly at Crowthorne. "I want love. Mr. Crowthorne, or at least the possibility of it." Crowthorne's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Love? You came here as a mail-order bride, not a fairy tale princess. Love is a luxury women in your position can't afford. Maybe that's where you're wrong." Maverick stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding. "Maybe love is exactly what she deserves. And you're prepared to offer that, are you?" Crowthorne's voice dripped with contempt. "A mountain hermit with dirt under his fingernails and mud on his boots?" "I'm prepared to offer her choice," Maverick replied evenly. "Something you seem to think she's not entitled to." Crowthorne turned back to Cordelia, his expression calculating. "Think carefully, Miss Whitmore. I'm offering you respectability, a place in proper society, financial security. What is he offering you? A cabin in the wilderness and a life of isolation?" For a moment, Cordelia wavered. Everything Crowthorne said was true. He was offering safety, respectability, the kind of life her mother had always wanted for her. But she thought of the way he'd looked at her like merchandise, the way he'd already begun arranging her life without consulting her wishes. Then she looked at Maverick, remembering the way he'd listened to her stories without judgment, the careful distance he'd maintained despite the attraction crackling between them, the respect in his voice when he called her strong for surviving what she'd survived. "He's offering me freedom," she said quietly. "The freedom to choose my own path, even if it's difficult, even if it's uncertain." Crowthorne's face darkened. "If you walk away from me now, don't expect to find another husband easily. Your reputation will be ruined. A woman who breaks her word, who travels unchaperoned with strange men." The threat was intended to cow her, but instead it only strengthened her resolve. "Then I suppose I'll have to learn to live with a ruined reputation. You'll regret this," Crowthorne spat. "Both of you. Mark my words, you'll come crawling back within a month, begging me to reconsider." "I don't think so," Maverick said mildly. "But if we do, you'll be the first to know." As they turned to leave, Mrs. Hartwell called after them. "Where will you go? What will you do?" Cordelia paused, suddenly realizing the enormity of what she'd just done. She had no money, no prospects, no plan beyond the desperate hope that Maverick's offer had been genuine. For a terrifying moment, the weight of her decision crashed over her. Then Maverick's hand found hers, steady and sure. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. "Together." The word sent a thrill through her. Together. Not as owner and property, not as arrangement and convenience, but as partners choosing to face whatever came next side by side. The ride back to Maverick's cabin felt different from their morning journey. Where before there had been the weight of inevitability, now there was the electric uncertainty of possibility. Cordelia sat behind Maverick on Storm, her arms around his waist, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of running away. "Are you having second thoughts?" Maverick asked as they paused to water. Storm at a creek that tumbled down from the high country. Cordelia considered the question seriously. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But no second thoughts. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm making a choice that's truly mine." Maverick nodded, understanding the distinction. "We don't have to rush into anything," Marriage, I mean. We can take time to see if this, whatever this is between us, if it's real. And if it's not, he met her gaze directly. Then we'll figure that out too. But Cordelia, I need you to know whatever happens between us romantically, you'll always have a place on my mountain. A home if you want it. The simple generosity of the offer brought tears to her eyes. Why? Why would you do that for someone you barely know? Maverick was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. Because 15 years ago, someone should have done it for Catherine when her family disowned her for marrying a poor rancher. Because sometimes we're put in each other's paths for a reason. He looked at her then, his weathered face serious. And because you're not someone I barely know, not anymore. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. As they dismounted, Cordelia found herself seeing the place with new eyes, not as a temporary shelter, but as a potential home. The cabin was small but well built, the land around it wild and beautiful. She could imagine a garden thriving in the protected valley, maybe chickens in a larger coop, perhaps even a cow for fresh milk. It's not much, Maverick said, misreading her contemplation as disappointment. It's perfect, she said, surprising them both with her conviction. It's exactly what I didn't know I was looking for. That evening, they sat by the fire again, but the atmosphere was different now. The desperate intimacy of the storm had been replaced by something quieter but more solid, the beginning of real partnership. They talked about practical things, how to expand the cabin, what crops might grow in the mountain soil, whether the nearest neighbors would accept a woman with a ruined reputation. There's a preacher in Silver Creek, about 2 days' ride south. Maverick mentioned casually, Reverend McAllister. He's married folks who found themselves in unconventional circumstances before. Cordelia looked up from the sock she was mending. One of his, she'd noticed, had holes large enough to put her fist through. Is that a proposal, Maverick Holloway? He grinned, the expression transforming his weathered features. I reckon it is, though I'm doing it backward, asking you to marry me after you've already agreed to stay. Maybe backward is exactly right for us. She set down her mending and moved to sit beside him. We seem to do everything unconventionally. Is that a yes? Instead of answering with words, Cordelia leaned forward and kissed him. It was her first freely chosen kiss, given without coercion or expectation, and the sweetness of it took her breath away. Maverick's arms came around her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break if handled roughly. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Yes, she whispered, it's yes. 3 months later, Cordelia stood in the doorway of what was now undeniably their cabin, watching Maverick repair the fence around their expanded vegetable garden. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the aspen trees scattered across the Kidi mountainside had begun their annual transformation into living gold. She pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, smiling at the secret she carried. Dr. Henderson from Silver Creek had confirmed what she'd suspected for the past week. By next spring, there would be 3 inhabitants of this mountain sanctuary instead of 2. The wedding had been simple, held in Reverend McAllister's small chapel with only the Reverend's wife as witness. Cordelia had worn her mother's pearl necklace, the one piece of jewelry she hadn't sold for travel money, over a dress of deep blue wool that Maverick had insisted on buying her. He'd looked magnificent in his best shirt and the new vest she'd sewn for him, his dark hair tamed for once and his weathered hands gentle as he slipped his mother's ring onto her finger. Mrs. Holloway, he'd said afterward, testing the sound of her new name. I like the way that sounds. So do I, she'd whispered back, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The month since had been a revelation. Living with Maverick was nothing like the careful negotiation she'd expected from marriage. He consulted her on decisions large, and small, from where to plant the winter wheat to whether they should add another room to the cabin. He listened when she spoke, laughed at her attempts to cook his favorite foods, and held her close on the nights when memories of her stepfather's cruelty visited her dreams. In return, she brought laughter back to his mountain. She sang while she worked, filling the cabin with melodies that seemed to lift his spirits. She'd convinced him to attend the harvest dance in Silver Creek, where she'd watched with fierce pride as the local women grudgingly admitted that the hermit rancher had chosen well. Most importantly, she'd helped him lay Catherine's ghost to rest, not by erasing his first wife's memory, but by proving that the heart could love deeply more than once. "You're looking mighty pleased with yourself, Mrs. Holloway," Maverick called out, noticing her watching him. "Just thinking about how lucky we are," she called back. He set down his tools and walked over to her, his gait still carrying that easy confidence that had first caught her attention. At 42, he was more handsome than ever, the harsh lines of grief softened by contentment. "Lucky?" He pulled her into his arms, not caring that his shirt was dusty from work. "Lady, luck had nothing to do with it. That was pure providence." Cordelia laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "Providence, was it? Had to be. What else would you call a storm dropping the perfect woman on my doorstep just when I'd convinced myself I was better off alone?" "I'd call it the best decision I ever made," she said, then paused, suddenly nervous. "Maverick, there's something I need to tell you." Something in her tone made him pull back to study her face. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm more than all right." She took his hands and placed them on her stomach. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Maverick went completely still, his eyes wide with shock. Then a smile spread across his face, not the careful, measured expressions she'd grown accustomed to, but a grin of pure, unguarded joy. "A baby?" His voice was wondering, almost reverent. "Are you sure?" "Dr. Henderson confirmed it yesterday when I rode to Silver Creek for supplies. I wanted to be certain before I told you." Maverick swept her up in his arms, spinning her around, until she laughed and begged him to put her down. "A baby," he repeated, as if trying to make the miracle real through repetition. "Our baby. Are you happy?" she asked, though his expression made the question unnecessary. "Happy?" He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "Cordelia, I thought my life was over when Catherine died. I thought the best I could hope for was to exist quietly until my time came. But you brought me back to life. And now you're giving me a future I never dared dream of." As the sun climbed higher over their mountain home, they stood together in the doorway, planning their expansion of the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Cordelia thought of the desperate woman who had stumbled through a storm to this door, seeking nothing more than shelter for one night. She could never have imagined that she would find not just safety, but love, purpose, and a happiness so complete it sometimes took her breath away. "No regrets?" Maverick asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding night. Cordelia looked out over the land that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had become her anchor, and felt the tiny spark of new life growing within her. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Storm nickering in the pasture and the wind singing through the pines. This wild, beautiful place had given her everything she'd never known she wanted. "None," she said firmly, "not a single one." And as Maverick kissed her in the doorway of their mountain home, with their unborn child safe between them and forever stretching out ahead, Cordelia knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the best journeys were the ones that began with having nowhere else to go.